There is a Bible that most of the Western world has never read, not because it is hidden, not because it is forbidden, because for 1700 years it was kept alive by one specific community of Christians in one specific corner of Africa, in an ancient language that almost no one outside that community could read. And while the councils of Rome and Carthage and Laodicea were deciding which books belonged in the Christian scriptures and which books did not, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church quietly preserved everything. Every text that the Western tradition classified as lost, apocryphal, or too dangerous to include, preserved, copied, chanted in monasteries, translated across centuries, and passed down in an unbroken chain from the earliest days of Christianity to the present moment. The Ethiopian Bible contains 81 books. The Protestant Bible contains 66. The Catholic Bible contains 73. Every book in both of those canons is also in the Ethiopian Bible. And then there are 15 more. Books that were read in the earliest Christian communities, quoted in the New Testament itself, preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then quietly excluded as the Western Church standardized its canon through a series of councils in the 4th and 5th centuries. Those 15 books survived in one place, Ethiopia. And what they say about the end of the world, about the nature of angels and demons, about the cosmic architecture that underlies human history, is so dramatically different from what most Western Christians have been taught that understanding them genuinely changes how you read the Bible you already have. This is the story of what the Ethiopian Bible actually contains, where it came from, why it survived when everything else was lost, and what the books that the West removed say about the end times that the version most of the world reads does not say, not rumor, not conspiracy, the documented, verified, academically established content of the oldest, complete Christian canon in the world. Let us begin with the institution that preserved it. Because the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church is not a fringe organization or a recent development, it is one of the oldest continuous Christian institutions on earth, and its history is a direct refutation of the assumption that Christianity was primarily a Western religion whose center of gravity was always Rome. Christianity came to Ethiopia extraordinarily early. The tradition within the Ethiopian Church traces its origins to a specific passage in the New Testament, Acts chapter 8, verses 26 through 39, in which Philip the Evangelist, one of the original disciples, encounters an Ethiopian court official traveling back from Jerusalem where he had been worshiping. He was reading from the scroll of Isaiah. Philip explained to him that the passage he was reading referred to Jesus. The official was baptized in the roadside water and continued on his way. He returned to the court of Candace, queen of Ethiopians. And from that single encounter, the Ethiopian Church traces a direct line of apostolic origin that predates the conversion of any European nation by centuries. The historical confirmation of Ethiopian Christianity is not merely traditional. Archaeologically, Ethiopia's ancient kingdom of Aksum adopted Christianity as its state religion under King Ezana in the 4th century, approximately 330 CE, making it one of the first nations in human history to officially Christianize. This happened before the conversion of many major European kingdoms, and it happened independently, in a theological environment shaped by proximity to the Hebrew Bible's world, rather than by the political priorities of the Roman Empire. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church did not develop under Roman influence. It developed under its own theological logic, in its own language. Ge'ez, an ancient Semitic language closely related to the languages of the Hebrew Scriptures, and in its own encounter with the texts that the earliest Christians read. And that independence from Rome is precisely why the Ethiopian canon looks different from the Western one. The councils that standardized the Western biblical canon, Laodicea in 363 CE, Hippo in 393 CE, Carthage in 397 CE, did not have authority over the Ethiopian Church. When those councils debated which books to include and which to exclude, Ethiopian Christianity was operating according to its own tradition, its own liturgical practice, and its own understanding of which texts were sacred. The Ethiopian Church was not present at those councils. It did not sign the agreements, and it did not revise its canon to match the conclusions the Western councils reached. The result is a Bible that looks, from the perspective of Western Christianity, like it contains extra material. From the perspective of Ethiopian Christianity, the Western canon looks like it is missing things that should be there. Now let us talk about what is actually in those 15 additional books, because this is where the story becomes genuinely extraordinary, and where the question of what the Ethiopian Bible says about the end times begins to take real shape. The most significant of the additional books, the one that scholars, theologians, and every serious student of the New Testament eventually has to reckon with, is the Book of Enoch. And to understand why the Book of Enoch matters so much, you need to start with a single verse that is already in every Western Bible, in a book that has been in the Protestant and Catholic canons for 2,000 years, the Book of Jude, verse 14. It reads, "Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied about them. See, the Lord is coming with thousands upon thousands of his holy ones to judge everyone and to convict all of them of all the ungodly acts they have committed. The author of Jude, a canonical book accepted by every Christian tradition, is quoting a prophecy. He attributes it to Enoch, the seventh from Adam. He presents it as scripture, as authoritative prophecy about the judgment of the ungodly. That quotation from the first chapter of the book of Enoch is not paraphrased or approximate. It is a near verbatim citation. The Western New Testament quotes a book that the Western Old Testament does not contain. The book of Enoch exists in the Ethiopian Bible as fully canonical scripture. It has existed there in its complete form in the ancient Ge'ez language since at least the 4th century, pious before the Western councils that excluded it met. The oldest surviving manuscripts of the complete book of Enoch are Ethiopian. Not Jewish, not Greek, Ethiopian. If Ethiopia had not preserved it, the book of Enoch would today be known only through fragments found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, the scrolls discovered in caves near Qumran in 1947 that suddenly revealed to the modern world that texts which Western Christianity had long classified as lost or marginal had been central to the religious world of the community that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls. And what the book of Enoch actually says is unlike anything in the 66 or 73 book canon. The book of Enoch opens with the prophetic declaration that the Western Bible quotes in Jude, but that is the beginning, not the heart of it. The heart of the book of Enoch is what scholars call the Book of the Watchers, the first major section covering chapters 1 through 36, and it tells a story that sits directly behind one of the most cryptic and most theologically loaded passages in the entire Western Bible, Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. Most Western readers have encountered it and found it puzzling. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose, and then the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. Who are the sons of God? Who are the Nephilim? The Western canon does not explain. It offers the passage without context, without backstory, without the theological architecture that makes sense of it. Commentators have debated it for centuries. Some read the sons of God as the godly descendants of Seth intermarrying with the ungodly descendants of Cain. Some read them as a metaphor. Some read them as angelic beings. The text is cryptic, and the Western canon offers nothing else to clarify it. The Book of Enoch explains it in extraordinary specific detail. The sons of God are the Watchers, 200 of them, a specific group of angels assigned to observe and guide humanity, who looked at the daughters of men and made a collective, deliberate decision to violate the boundary between the divine and the human. Their leader, named Semjaza in the text, gathered them on the summit of Mount Hermon, a real mountain in what is today the border region between Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. And they swore an oath together. They descended. They took wives from among human women. They taught humanity things it was not supposed to know. Metallurgy, the making of weapons, sorcery, astrology, the art of cosmetics and ornamentation. And the children born from those unions were the Nephilim, beings of enormous size and power who consumed first the produce of the earth, then the animals, and finally turned upon human beings themselves. The consequence in the Book of Enoch's narrative is the flood. God looks at what the Watchers have done and dispatches 4 archangels, Michael, Serachiel, Raphael, and Gabriel, to deal with the situation. Raphael is specifically commissioned to bind the leader of the fallen Watchers, a being named Azazel, and confine him in the darkness beneath the desert of Dudel until the day of judgment. Michael is commissioned to bind Semjaza and the other Watchers in the valleys of the earth. And then the flood comes, not simply as punishment for human sin, as the Western Genesis presents it, but as a cosmic cleanup operation, clearing the earth of the hybrid offspring and the corrupted civilization that the Watchers' transgression had produced. This is the cosmological background that the Western canon assumes but never explains. The Book of Enoch is the explanation. And it was read in the world where Jesus taught and the New Testament authors wrote as authoritative background to the Genesis narrative, not by fringe groups, by the mainstream of Second Temple Jewish and early Christian religious life. The end times dimension of the Book of Enoch is what makes it most significant for understanding what the Ethiopian Bible preserves that the Western tradition lost. Because the Book of Enoch is not primarily a book about the distant past. It is primarily a book of prophecy about the end, about judgment, about the fate of the fallen Watchers and the righteous and the wicked, about the arrival of what Enoch calls the Son of Man. The term Son of Man appears throughout the Gospels. Jesus uses it more than any other self-designation. In the Gospel of Mark alone, it appears 14 times. In Matthew, 30 times. In Luke, 25 times. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. The Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. You will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. It is the most frequent messianic title in the Synoptic Gospels, and its theological content, what Son of Man means, what vision it evokes in the minds of first-century Jewish listeners, comes directly from the Book of Enoch's Similitudes, also called the Book of Parables, which occupies chapters 37 through 71. In those chapters, Enoch receives visions of a heavenly figure, pre-existent, righteous, hidden before the creation of the world, chosen by God before the foundation of the earth, called the Son of Man. This figure sits on a throne of glory. He judges the kings and the mighty of the earth. He vindicates the righteous who suffered under unjust power. He destroys the wicked. He establishes a kingdom. The specific imagery, the specific language, the specific theological claims about this Son of Man figure in the Book of Enoch's Parables are so close to what Jesus says about the Son of Man in the Gospels that scholars who have worked through the comparison carefully have described their relationship as one of the most significant parallels in the entire field of New Testament studies. The end times vision in the Book of Enoch is not the rapture. It is not the specific sequence of events that Western prophecy culture, built largely on the Book of Revelation and the Left Behind framework that emerged from a 19th century theological movement called dispensationalism, has made familiar to hundreds of millions of evangelical Christians. The Ethiopian Bible's end times vision is older, more cosmic, more deeply rooted in the prophetic traditions of Second Temple Judaism. It is a vision of divine judgment on the structures of earthly power, cosmic restoration, the vindication of the righteous poor against the wickedly wealthy, and the establishment of a new order under the figure of the Son of Man, whose arrival the Gospels announce. The Book of Jubilees, the second major text preserved in the Ethiopian canon that the Western tradition excludes, adds another dimension to the end times picture. Called the Little Genesis in the Ethiopian tradition, it retells the entire narrative of Genesis and the early chapters of Exodus, covering the same ground as the Western canon, but with a completely different temporal architecture underlying it. Jubilees organizes all of human history into cycles of 49 years, 7 weeks of 7 years each, what the book calls Jubilees. Every event in human history, from creation to the giving of the law at Sinai, is mapped onto this Jubilee calendar. Creation itself is dated with mathematical precision. The stories of the patriarchs, Adam and Eve, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, are assigned specific years within specific jubilees. The entire narrative of human history is presented not as a loose sequence of events, but as a sacred mathematical architecture, a cosmic clock ticking toward an appointed end. The eschatological vision of jubilees, its vision of what happens at the end of the Jubilee calendar, is one of restoration and purification rather than catastrophic destruction. The book looks forward to a time when human beings will live long lives again, when the earth will be cleansed of the consequences of the Watcher's transgression, when Israel will be gathered, when the sanctuary of God will be established among human beings forever. It is a vision of renewal rather than abandonment, a vision in which the earth itself is redeemed rather than destroyed and replaced. For readers shaped by the Western end times tradition, the rapture, the tribulation, the destruction of the earth, the evacuation of the saved to a purely spiritual heaven, the eschatology of Jubilees is genuinely disorienting. It does not evacuate the righteous from the earth. It transforms the earth. The trajectory of human history in Jubilees reading is not abandonment but redemption, not escape but restoration, not the destruction of creation but its renewal. This distinction between an eschatology of escape and an eschatology of restoration is one of the deepest theological divides between the Western prophetic tradition and what the Ethiopian Bible preserves. And scholars who work in this area note that the restoration eschatology of Jubilees is actually more consistent with the Hebrew prophet's vision of the end times, Isaiah's new creation, Ezekiel's restored temple, the whole earth filled with the knowledge of God as the waters cover the sea, than the evacuation eschatology that Western evangelical culture has made its default framework. Now, let us address the question that sits at the center of this entire story. Why were these books removed? If they were so widely read, so theologically significant, so clearly embedded in the world that produced the New Testament, why did the Western councils of the 4th and 5th centuries set them aside? The answer is not simple, and it is not reducible to a conspiracy. It involves a combination of factors that scholars have been working through for decades. The first factor is the pseudepigrapha problem. Books like Enoch and Jubilees are written in the name of ancient patriarchal figures. Enoch, the seventh from Adam, the voice of the angels and archangels who reveal the Jubilee calendar. The historical distance between when those patriarchs supposedly lived and when the books were actually composed is vast. Scholars date the oldest sections of former Enoch to approximately 300 to 200 BCE, long after Enoch would have lived by any biblical chronology. Jubilees is similarly dated to the 2nd century BCE. The councils that standardized the Western canon were, among other things, trying to distinguish between books with clear apostolic connection and books with disputed or clearly pseudepigraphical authorship. Enoch and Jubilees failed that test in the eyes of the Western councils, even though they passed it in Ethiopian tradition. The second factor is theological sensitivity. The Book of Enoch's cosmology, the Watchers, the Nephilim, the fallen angels who taught humanity forbidden knowledge, sits in complex relationship with the theological frameworks that were becoming dominant in 4th and 5th century Christianity. A Christianity that was defining its anthropology, its understanding of the nature of human beings, the nature of sin, the nature of salvation, had reasons to be cautious about texts that attributed a significant portion of human evil not to human free will, but to the actions of rebellious angels who violated the cosmic order. Augustine's theology of original sin, which became foundational for Western Christianity, locates the source of human corruption in Adam's choice in the garden. The Book of Enoch locates a major source of human corruption in the choice of the Watchers on Mount Hermon. These are not incompatible, but they create a different theological emphasis that the Western councils were not necessarily prepared to accommodate. The third factor is survival. The physical preservation of manuscripts across 17 centuries requires an institution with the stability, the continuity, and the physical security to protect those manuscripts through invasions, fires, political upheavals, and the ordinary deterioration of time. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church in the highlands of eastern Africa provided that stability in a way that no other institution preserved Enoch or Jubilees in complete form. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947 revealed that fragments of Enoch had been copied at Qumran, suggesting that the text was significant enough to be preserved there. But the complete text survived only in Gaz, only in Ethiopia, only because Ethiopian monks made copying sacred manuscripts an act of devotion and did not stop. The modern rediscovery of the Ethiopian Bible's unique content is genuinely recent, and its implications are still being worked through in academic theology, in biblical scholarship, and in popular religious culture simultaneously. The Book of Enoch was essentially unknown to Western scholarship until the Scottish explorer James Bruce brought 3 copies of the Gayas manuscript back from Ethiopia in 1773. R. H. Charles produced the first major critical edition and English translation in 1906. The Dead Sea Scrolls discovery in 1947 provided Aramaic fragments confirming that the Enoch tradition was ancient and Palestinian rather than a late Ethiopian invention. And in the decades since, scholarship on Enoch has become one of the most active fields in biblical studies because the implications of what it contains for understanding the New Testament are profound and still being fully mapped. George Nicholsburg, Ephraim Isaac, and Gabriel Boccaccini are among the scholars who have made the case most clearly. For Enoch was not peripheral to the world that produced Jesus and the New Testament authors. It was central. It was one of the most widely distributed Jewish texts of the Second Temple period. It was copied at Qumran. It was quoted in the New Testament. It shaped the vocabulary, the imagery, and the theological expectations that Jesus' first listeners brought to everything they heard him say. The Son of Man of the Gospels cannot be fully understood without the Son of Man of the Book of Parables. The cosmic judgment that Jude prophesies cannot be understood without the Enoch tradition from which Jude is quoting. What this means in practice is that the Ethiopian Bible is not a different Bible with exotic additions. It is a larger Bible that preserves the context that makes the smaller Bible fully intelligible. The books that the Western tradition excluded were not marginal to the world that produced the scriptures the Western tradition kept. They were the background, the framework, the cosmological architecture within which those scriptures were written. Excluding them did not remove them from their influence on the texts that remained. It simply removed the reader's access to the framework that the canonical texts were presupposing. There is a dimension to this story that connects directly to the contemporary moment, and it explains why the Ethiopian Bible has generated so much popular interest in recent years, interest that has sometimes been expressed in sensationalized form, but that reflects a genuine and legitimate hunger for exactly what the Ethiopian tradition preserves. Western Christianity, particularly in its evangelical and charismatic expressions, has developed an elaborate end-times theology over the past century and a half. The framework most widely known, the pre-tribulation rapture, the 7-year tribulation, the Antichrist, the Battle of Armageddon, the Millennium, derives primarily from a specific interpretive tradition called dispensationalism, developed in the 19th century by a British theologian named John Nelson Darby and popularized in the United States through the Scofield Reference Bible, and most recently through the Left Behind series. This framework is not ancient. It is not the historical consensus of the Church. It was not the dominant end-times theology of Christianity for its first 1800 years. The end-times theology preserved in the Ethiopian Bible is older. It is rooted in the prophetic traditions of the Hebrew Bible, in the Second Temple Jewish literature that shaped the world of Jesus and the apostles, and in the patristic writers of the first 3 centuries who inhabited a cosmological world that included the Watchers, the Nephilim, the Son of Man, the Jubilee calendar, and the cosmic battle between faithful and fallen angels that the Book of Enoch describes in such extraordinary detail. Origen, Tertullian, Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, the writers of the early church read and engaged with the Book of Enoch. It was part of their theological world. It shaped what they believed about angels, about demons, about the nature of the cosmic conflict that human history unfolds within. The growing popular interest in the Ethiopian Bible is, in significant part, an interest in recovering that older, fuller, more cosmologically rich theological world, the world that the Western canon assumes but no longer explains, the world in which the Jude quotation of Enoch makes sense because you have read the text being quoted, the world in which the sons of God in Genesis chapter 6 are not a puzzling editorial footnote but the opening scene of a cosmic drama that the Book of Enoch unfolds in detail, the world in which the Son of Man in the Gospels carries the full weight of the Enochic vision of the heavenly judge who will vindicate the righteous poor and judge the mighty of the earth. Here is what the Ethiopian Bible actually teaches about the end times, drawn from the texts it preserves that the Western canon does not. The end is not primarily an evacuation of the righteous from a doomed earth. It is a judgment of the structures of power that have oppressed the righteous on earth, followed by the restoration of that earth to its intended purpose. The wicked are not primarily abstract sinners, but specifically the powerful, the kings, the mighty, the wealthy, who acquired their prosperity through injustice. The Son of Man who presides over the judgment is not a new figure invented in the Gospels, but a pre-existent heavenly reality who has been waiting since before the creation of the world for the appointed moment of disclosure. The cosmic conflict underlying human history is not primarily a conflict between human virtue and human vice, but a conflict between faithful and fallen angelic powers, in which human beings are both participants and stakes. And the goal of all of it, the end toward which the Jubilee calendar of Jubilees is ticking, the establishment that the Son of Man accomplishes in Enoch's vision, is not escape to another realm, but the transformation of this one. This is the vision that was preserved in the highlands of Ethiopia, in Gea's manuscripts copied by monks who understood the preservation of those texts as an act of faithfulness across 17 centuries, during which the Western world largely forgot that these books existed. It is the vision that the Dead Sea Scrolls confirmed was ancient and Palestinian and central to the world that produced Christianity. It is the vision that sits behind the canonical texts that billions of Christians read every day. Visible, once you know it is there, in every quotation of Enoch, in every invocation of the Son of Man, in every passage that assumes a cosmological world richer and more populated and more contested than the 66 or 73 book canon alone can show. The Ethiopian Bible is not a discovery. It has been there, read by Ethiopian Christians, chanted in Gea's liturgy, studied in Ethiopian monasteries for 1,700 years. What is new is that the rest of the world is paying attention. And what they are finding when they pay attention is not what they thought was missing. It is the context they did not know they needed to understand what they already had.